The next subcortical structure or structures we're going to discuss is the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is different from the other structures we've discussed so far because it's made up of a group of nuclei where the nuclei are much more physically separated, and some of the nuclei have completely different types of neurons from the others. The reason it's useful to view them as a single structure is a strong pattern of interconnectivity within the group. But before I start, there is some confusion over names. As in many parts of the brain, the names for anatomical structures in the basal ganglia have been given over a long period of time. Many of the names are in Latin and describe some obvious physical attribute of the structure. Sometimes different names have been given to the same structure. Also, sometimes one structure has later been seen to be more than one, or two named structures have been found to be essentially one structure. So the naming can get very complex and confusing, and I'm going to go over that for the basal ganglia. One major structure in the basal ganglia is called the striatum because of its streaky appearance. The striatum is commonly divided into the caudate nucleus and the putamen. The putamen seems to be associated somehow with motor movements and the caudate with cognition, but they look very similar even in detail. The globus pallidus is a second structure that's located close to the striatum. It's subdivided into an internal segment and an external segment. The two segments are slightly separated, but they have similar neurons and differ mainly in their connectivity with other anatomical structures. The subthalamic nucleus is another compact group of neurons, and the substantia nigra is a structure lower down in the brainstem. Its name comes from its dark appearance. The SN also has two parts, the reticulata and the compacta. But these two parts are actually very different, having different types of neuron and different connectivity. In fact, the SNR is much more similar in neurons and connectivity to the GPI, and they're often regarded as essentially the same structure that's accidentally been separated into two parts by an axon bundle passing through. In fact, in some mammal species like the dolphin, the two structures are not actually separated. So we're going to refer to the two substructures as the GPI-SNR. Another complicating factor is that all of these structures together, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, subthalamic nucleus, substantia nigra, are sometimes called the dorsal basal ganglia, and the putamen and caudate then become the dorsal striatum. The reason for this is that there's a parallel structure that we could call the ventral basal ganglia. In the ventral basal ganglia, there's a ventral striatum. And another confusing factor is this ventral striatum is sometimes called the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens also has two substructures, the core and the shell. But these two substructures are rather more different from each other than the putamen and caudate. The core is actually quite like the dorsal basal ganglia, but the shell has a different pattern of connectivity and different neurotransmitter sensitivities. The ventral basal ganglia also has a ventral pallidum that corresponds with the globus pallidus. It has a part of the subthalamic nucleus and also a ventral tegmental area that corresponds with the pars compacta of the substantia nigra. The combination of putamen, caudate, and nucleus accumbens, core, and shell is sometimes referred to as a whole as the striatum. But sometimes the term striatum just means the dorsal the dorsal striatum. Finally, the pars compacta and the ventral tegmental area contain most of the dopaminergic neurons in the brain and are together sometimes referred to as the midbrain dopamine neurons. This shows the locations of the different nuclei of the basal ganglia within the cortical hemispheres. The substantia nigra, illustrated in pale blue, is located low down in the brainstem, but the rest are located around the outside of the thalamus, which is not illustrated in this picture, centrally between the two cortical hemispheres. The globus pallidus in red brackets the lower part of the thalamus. The putamen part of the striatum, in green, is on the outside of the thalamus and globus pallidus. The caudate nucleus part of the striatum, in darker blue, curls over the top of the putamen. The ventral striatum, or nucleus accumbens, is located down at the tip of the caudate. And the subthalamic nucleus, in purple, is located under the thalamus. So these are the structures, the different nuclei of the basal ganglia and their positions relative to each other within the brain. And next we're going to talk about the neurons, the types of neurons that these different structures contain.